Hello once again, I'm Rob Chadwick and I'm here with Nick Copson, the ex-head of marketing for 20 plus years for a range of national news media outlets, and Bill Martin, who has 35 years in regional press, 20 as editor for both evening and morning titles, and we are the hosts of Stop the Press. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, Robert.
Hello,
Robert. Hello, Bill.
How are you doing today? Answer some questions while I get my notes up. What have you been up to in the last week then, Nick?
In the last week, working, dog walking, children looking after. Had a nice weekend away in Bath and Exeter, just gone. 2 cities. And that's about it, really. So
Splendid. What about you, Bill?
Cricket.
Yeah?
Cricket. Watching, umpiring, organising, bit of training.
I'm very much looking forward to going to the Old Trafford Test this year. Got
Okay.
tickets for the Friday. It's going to be amazing.
Lucky you.
Yeah, can't wait.
Don't drink too much.
Well, exactly, yeah. Although I think that's practically impossible at a Test match, isn't it? 7 hours in
It's a
that
long
place.
day.
Yeah. So, hello everybody. We are this week looking to talk about reform and the resurgence, and not resurgence, the surge of reform's popularity, and politics in general, and the way it's covered within the media. And is there some media bias against certain parties and not against others? Are the media certainly traditional media, a little bit too focused on the two-party system, and does the two-party system even exist anymore? Those sorts of questions. So I wanted to start by sort of setting out the rules around reporting politics, and I thought the best person to do this is Bill. So Bill, what are the challenges involved in covering politics within a newspaper?
Well, it depends who you work for, but essentially it's balance. So everyone's looking for balance from in their political reporting. And if you work for non-political titles, like I always did, apart from, a brief stint on the Mail or the Telegraph, who definitely wouldn't be non-political titles.
But the Evening Herald considered itself a non-political title.
100%, yeah.
Right.
The Evening Herald did, and the West Morning News did when I was editing them. Well, both prior to me editing them and when I was editing them. So the key is balance. When you were editing titles like the ones I did, the easiest thing was, you were representing the city and speaking for the city. When I was editing the West Morning News, I always saw myself as representing the region and particularly the countryside and that sort of stuff when it was the West Morning News, rather than any sort of political party.
So asking the questions that the general public were thinking but couldn't because they didn't have access to the politicians, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly that. And, the rule for me, and politicians always complain about their coverage in the local press, the rule for me, as long as both sides were complaining, then we were getting it about right. And most of the time we got it right. There was some issues we would campaign on which upset local politicians, and some when we campaigned alongside local politicians. It was judging what we thought was right and what our readers thought were right about a particular issue, rather than taking sides in politics.
And do you think you got the balance right most of the time?
Well, of course I did. Of course I think that. Most of the time I think we did, yeah. I think sometimes it's hard.
Can you think of any examples where you felt, where looking back you felt maybe we were a bit too harsh on them, or we were a bit too easy on them?
Definitely there were times when I think we were perhaps too easy on the establishment. If you know what I mean, I think if you take Plymouth, for example, what happened around the airport, I think we were slightly complicit in the airport becoming, what essentially now is a waste of space, isn't it? So there's an issue there. But I think there were some times, when we had to stand really firm in order to ask the right questions. And the one I remember most was, in the rise of New Labour, when Tony Blair first became Prime Minister, their press machine was really effective. They were very focused on press at every level, and in the regions, their MPs were trained to get onto us and to work with us, and they were very disciplined about the message that was coming, and sometimes it was. I can remember, there were all these announcements about, they're going to invest in this, they're going to invest in that, they're going to invest in this, they're going to invest in. easy to go with that sort of tidal wave of fantastic positive news, when you get a new government in. But of course, a lot of those announcements were re-announcements, or there was no new money. That would be the cry that came up from the opposition. So sometimes sorting out the truth from what were the political stories was quite difficult, but it's great fun. I love political journalism.
So that leads me to another great question, and I think this probably now involves both of you. Who do we think are the best political journalists stroke reporters? Who in the current and over the years have been the best at it, do you think?
In terms of individuals, I mean, I think it's really difficult to single out individuals because they...
Yeah, who gets it right, who's really good at asking the difficult questions, all of that type of stuff.
I mean, I'd go back to last week. I think the BBC have always been the best at it. In terms of impartiality and balance, lots of people would disagree with me on that. And I think some of the broadsheet newspapers, because even if you take a paper like the Telegraph, which is definitely right-leaning, but its coverage used to be, and I hasten to add used to be because I don't think it's quite as balanced as it used to be, was a very good political reporting operation, if you know what I mean.
What about you, Nick? Who do you sort of admire? Who do you read and think, yep, they've got it about right?
Not so much the journalists, but in terms of the media, I obviously grew up as a Daily Mail reader, unfortunately, and I'm slightly sort of ashamed by that now, really. But it's still in my blood a little bit, and we can talk about that when we talk what we're going to talk about later on. As I moved away from that now, I'm still probably slightly right of centre, and it'll probably towards the Telegraph or something like that. But that's where I often seek to have my own opinions validated, I suspect.
Yeah. And which papers do we think are very biased nowadays in terms of their political coverage? I know I kind of would always say things like the Mail and the Telegraph, but also the Guardian, I think, is as biased, but in the opposite direction. What about you guys? What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. Biased is a hard one, isn't it? It's is the Daily Express biased, or is the Daily Express articulating the views of what is identified as its readers, if you know what I mean? Yeah. So, I would still say that media outlets are doing the latter. Of course, that comes across as part of political bias, but I think you can say at the minute the Mirror's in a difficult spot, isn't it? Because the current government is adopting some policies that would not be seen as being traditional Labour policies.
Or trying to.
Or trying to. You've got this irritant who we're going to talk about in a minute, who's become considerably more than an irritant now, haven't they? So, for a paper like, traditional left-wing paper like the Mirror, they're in a difficult spot. They're in a very difficult spot in how to support a Labour government or not, and how not to support the now major irritant.
Yeah. The other thing as well, that newspapers, they've always obviously chased copy sales, naturally. They are commercial entities. But with online news, they're ever more so than ever, they're chasing clicks. And therefore their political bias, I think, can get more extreme, or perceived to be more extreme, based on what it thinks, to your point, their audience wants. They can attract more and more audience by perhaps being more biased towards a certain agenda.
Yeah, and the people who are really kind of likely to click through to stories are already committed. They're either one side or the other, and just want to read something that's going to reaffirm what they already believe most of the time.
Yeah.
So that leads to a more extreme reporting, because you want to make sure you do something that is going to get that click from that person who's already relatively extreme. So we end up with a media that are pandering to maybe 5% of the population, but get a much louder voice than they probably should have.
Yeah, possibly, but I think, you need to look at the homepages of all the online main news brands at the minute. Politics doesn't always feature that highly on many of them, and when it does, it tends to be, shock horror, this has been announced, it's a tax rise, or, it's that sort of knee-jerk dog whistle type headline, which, Reform have become fantastic at exploiting that sort of headline at the minute. Politics doesn't sit that highly in terms of, a lot of people, a lot of publishers now.
No, indeed. Well, we've talked about Reform a couple of times, and we did want to talk about them a bit today. So
you'll see political stories appearing below Love Island, on what a website homepage, something underneath Love Island, or whatever.
We'd all rather look at a picture of Maya Jama than Nigel Farage, wouldn't we?
I guess we probably would.
I think that's basically a homepage staple, isn't it? So, moving on.
Well, most just stretching that point a bit more. Most politics has always been boring. Mr. Farage, I'm going to talk about in a minute, is ultimately making politics actually quite interesting at the moment, right? And suddenly, his background now is perhaps not the broadsheets and the tabloids, but it's actually probably social media.
Yeah.
So suddenly the stomping ground for politics isn't actually the traditional media anymore, really.
No, and you can. I read an article this morning actually about I think the editor of the New York Times, who was defending the fact that they're currently publishing a story about Donald Trump every 30 minutes, and some media commentators are saying, "Oh, you're giving him too much oxygen, etc., etc." But he defends that, in much in the same way as you've just articulated, Nick. Anything Trump does is newsworthy
and interesting.
It's interesting.
So, Reform have got 34% of the vote in the last survey, which was released this weekend. They're 8 points ahead of Labour, who are in second, and the Conservatives are almost out of the picture altogether now. Why do we think we've got to the point where Reform have got to that stage? What role has the media played in that?
Where do we start?
I don't know what role media have played in it, other than publishing and reporting on Reform's success. I think the problem is that many people are disillusioned with the Conservatives as a right-wing party. They're lacking leadership, and that have done really since David Cameron, to be honest. They're lacking any kind of clout and policy, from what I can tell. And there's a lot of people still very, very angry out there, angry about how Brexit was delivered, even though it was delivered, and seeking change. And actually, to be honest, I think the world has seen what Donald Trump is doing in America. They're seeing that it can be, led by a single populist figure, and I wonder if the population, and also Nigel Farage himself, are thinking perhaps we could do this in the UK.
Oh, I think he's definitely thinking that. I think there's lots of contributory factors, aren't there? But I think a complete collapse in the Conservatives has, as Nick says, there's sort of no other option out there. I don't think anyone actually believes that the Conservative Party is a properly functioning political organisation right now. I mean, it's been a definite decision, I think, by Kemi Badenoch to not say much, was it? Her opposition has been quite passive in the first part of this Labour government, because she wants to rebuild, whatever the Conservative ideology is, and build policy around that. That's kind of understandable, except then you've got this, this tiny chap with a pint of beer and a packet of fags who's prepared to jump into that silence and pretty much say anything that people want to hear. He's in Wales last week saying, I'm going to reopen coal mines. He's anything that's popular, Farage will say at the minute, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that attracts headlines, and he's become a very believable politician, hasn't he? And a very reportable politician. So, and his tactics as well. He doesn't pop up he doesn't speak in the Commons very often, does he? If he hasn't even ever, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But he's quite happy to go to a working man's club. So if anything, if the media have been complicit in that at all, it's because they'll go to the working man's club as well now and report on that. But he's highly reportable, isn't he?
He was the main. So Question Time during Brexit would talk about Brexit every week, but of course most politicians didn't want to go on there and be pro-Brexit. Even the ones who kind of supported it didn't want to go on Question Time to kind of rationalise it, because it felt to me like they didn't really have the rationale behind it. But so Farage ended up on Question Time every other week, and of course that was the start of the left saying, well, why is he getting so much publicity? Well, because he's the one who's available. He's the one who will say the things that producers need people to say in order to get the debate going and to get things interesting within their television programmes. Going back to what you were saying about clicks, etc., etc.
Politics is dull. It always has been dull. He's making it interesting. It's always been dull, but ultimately there's been nothing to compare it to until now, really. He's making it interesting. And also people are angry about the way the left is leaning. Always have been. Right-wing people, of course.
And left-wing people now.
Yeah, and also the right wings are angry now about the way the right wing's hanging, right? So no one's happy with the political status at the moment, and suddenly Reform UK come along and are just buying into that and tapping it, and to your point, saying whatever they think is going to harness. It's not about votes at the moment. I think it's about harnessing the conversation and the opinions.
It feels to me though that they're not really saying that much different. It's like then there's no one really saying, look at this massive debt, we've got to pay it off. All of their policies would be just as expensive.
Yeah, of course.
And they're not far from the same. You know, he's still treating the NHS like it's a sacred cow.
But they're still coming, like today's announcement, you know, I'm going to, what was it called, the Britannia visa or the Britannia pass, isn't it? He's done a big press conference this morning.
An ID card.
Yeah, and no. So foreign nationals can pay 250,000 one-off payment to come and live in the UK, and I'll use that money to spread about the poor. They're calling it the Robin Hood tax,
right.
aren't they? It's to encourage the wealthy to remain in Britain. Because he says that's important, and he'll use their money to spread around the poor and things like that. I mean, it's basic headline-seeking policy, isn't it? Quite clever, but heavily reported.
But then, if you really think about it, £250,000 is probably less than 1 year's tax that they should be paying, but are trying to avoid.
Yeah, nothing, exactly.
So, if that's 5 million,
exactly,
then I can see it being worthwhile. But £250,000 is just a way of getting his mates in by the back door.
But he's got the headline.
Yes,
he's got the headline. He's got the coverage.
Yeah,
he's had another defection. Another high-profile councillor has defected this morning, haven't they? So there's a lot of momentum going with him at the minute. So, back to your question whether the press has been complicit in that or not. I think it's not so much the press, but the media in general. Farage was resurrected by going on I'm a Celebrity.
Yep.
Again, a very clever move, because I think before that everyone would have said he was spent as a political force because he'd not been elected.
On about 5 occasions.
On about 5 occasions.
Parliament, hadn't he?
And then he goes on that, and supposedly gets paid more than anyone's ever been paid to appear on it, that sort of thing, but, whatever. But, if you watched it, it was really good TV. And he was able, and people say, oh, they allowed him to do it and that thing, but he resurrected his image as a human being then, and as a politician, and then 2 minutes later, having been kicked out of the jungle or winning, I can't even remember, it doesn't matter, but there he is back at the leader of Reform UK, and the fastest growing political party we've seen in our ever.
Yeah. So Reform voters would argue that the mainstream media, they're always talking about the MSM, are massively biased against Reform. Do we think they've got a point?
I think, no, I don't. I think they did. They may have had a point a year ago, but I think if anyone, a year ago, if you said, does anyone seriously think that Nigel Farage would become Prime Minister, we would all have said no. That reality has changed, hasn't it? And you can see that in a reflection. Well, I think you can see that now in how Reform is reported. It's remarkable what's happened, in that Reform is now unofficially, I think, but probably officially in many newsrooms as the opposition.
Yeah.
I think that's been accepted now. There seems to be no comeback from the official opposition at all. again, very difficult for her. Where does she go? So in a sense, the press have got no choice but to do what they're doing now. And I think, reform's being reported in a responsible manner by most publishers out there now.
They're being taken seriously.
Yes.
Which prior to now, they wouldn't have been. Most people wouldn't have seen them as a party. They would have seen them as a platform for anger or something. Right? They're now being taken as a serious player. Whether or not they get that far, I don't know. Right? But the one thing I'd like to think, and I've got an opinion that I think that at the moment I just think the Conservatives are dead. I don't know how they come back from the situation. Right?
Yeah.
They're just lacking any kind of politicians with any kind of calibre. I think that their ground is gone. But what I'd like to think is that reform forces anybody else to just pull their bloody socks up. It just feels like they're now they're a thing that can just force and encourage everyone else to actually take politics into a new direction. I don't know what that direction is, and I don't know if it's good or bad. But they have to, traditional left and right wing parties and policies have to listen and understand the people. They're the ones that bloody vote for them, and most of them are angry.
Yeah, they are, and they feel like they haven't been listened to, and that's why we got the Brexit vote. That's why we got Boris in. That's why we've got a number of different things happen over the last few years. That basically people feel like the mainstream parties have tootled along with the same agenda to all intents and purposes, whether it be Labour or the Tories for a good 30 years or so. And now suddenly the people in what's referred to as the Red Wall have said, right, actually, you're going to listen to us, and have done a number of things which have said, you must listen to us because otherwise we'll vote reform in, or we'll do this or we'll do that.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Do you remember when David Cameron said that of many very clever things he said, one of which was not, I'm going to call a referendum on whether we leave the EU. He said that Brexiteers, or the Brexit partisan, was populated by swivel-eyed lunatics, I think he called them. and at the time, I knew exactly what he was saying. Do you know what I mean? And that's where the sort of kernel of reform and Farage was at. Were these sort of angry sort of lunatics? You felt like on the far right,
sort of posh.
They've come,
twats kind of people,
exactly.
Wasn't it? Whereas actually,
but it's come a long way.
Posh twats, was it?
And that whole movement has come a long way since then, hasn't it? And it's got a much broader base now. This sort of disenchantment with the establishment and everything that's happened alongside. You can't dismiss it as racist anymore, even though. I'm sure there's a lot of reform supporters who are racist. It is an accepted fact now in Western Europe and America, and that's the thing, that lots of the population are bothered about illegal immigration, or levels of legal migration. And I think that's what with good reason. If you look at the housing stock in this country, etc., then there's good reason to be worried about migration. If you look at the amount we spend on migrants and keeping them in hotels, etc., then there's a reasonable case for being angry about migration. It's not an unreasonable thing to think that we shouldn't spend that much money on that.
Yeah, you're right. It's reasonable, but it's still based around, for most people, it's based around xenophobia and racism.
Yes.
It's horrible to say, but it is.
Yeah, I agree.
Most people aren't well enough informed on the economy and the financial aspect of it to actually go beyond pure hatred.
It's a much bigger problem than that was my issue.
Exactly.
With the Sunak "stop the boats" mantra is that the boats is a tiny part of the problem, isn't it?
It's almost a waste of time stopping the boats in terms of migration statistics. The amount of people that come over on a small boat is tiny.
Of course. I'll make another point on reform's, let's say, status at the moment, because as you know, I'm a marketing guy, and so whilst this is about news and journalism, there is a strong brand suddenly around Reform UK.
Yeah.
Right? Now, prior to that, it was UKIP, right, which was inherently racist, in not only in name but in policy.
That was
right?
the swivel-eyed loons, wasn't
Correct.
it?
Yeah. Brexit was obviously clearly a moment in time sort of brand identity. Clearly, can only ever be that. But reform feels like a word and a name that has suddenly got very strong stability around it to me, combined with, obviously, Farage and the weakness of the other parties at the moment, more so than any of the other staid party names that are out there. We don't get into the role of brand identity here, but, they're very old world. Reform suddenly comes in, suddenly has got talking a lot of sense in regard to public opinion. The name reflects that stature, I think, and the need for change. And it carries with it, that confidence, I think, amongst the not especially the voters at the moment, perhaps, because we're not there yet, but the general opinions of the UK population.
And the brand has got. I think that you're right, Nick. And the brand has got much bigger than the party in a sense, isn't it? So it means a lot more to people now. So I don't know if there's been a story out today or yesterday that Rupert Lowe, who I think is one of the 5 Reform MPs. Currently, he's the one who's fallen out with Farage, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
He
was the chairman and he's left because they weren't extreme enough.
Yeah, I think he paid his gamekeeper to shoot his dog. Have you seen that story?
I haven't seen that one. No.
So, a few months ago or a few years ago.
What a horrible man.
This would have been enormous. I think the dog was ill.
Even so?
Yeah.
What a horrible man.
But, you'd have thought 12 months ago, well, that'll be it. That'll be the end of reform, because obviously all lunatics. But reform's growing bigger than that now, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and it was a while ago. It was another party wouldn't be able to get a leg in the door, would they? I'm thinking about other upstart.
Well, Greens have tried to do it for a long
yeah.
time, haven't they?
Correct. Well, that was never going to happen, was it?
As of the Lib Dems.
The Lib Dems, yeah.
They've been trying ever since.
Yeah. Other than 2010, where they got the coalition government, but other than that, they've not really got a look in much. And they never managed to get more than sort of 70 MPs, do they? And to be honest, coming back to what you were saying about reform, it's all very well 4 years away from an election saying they feel like an established force and that they're here to stay. I'm not so convinced.
I'm not either.
We're 4 years away from an election. I can see them going down the drain by then.
I'm not either, but I think that's what I think. I think they will change the agenda over the next 4 years, and they'll force the other parties, the ones that are established ultimately, to ultimately up their game, and that has to be a positive thing.
Already changed the agenda, haven't they?
Yeah, of course they have.
You've got to say that Farage, whether you love him or hate him, has to be the most effective politician
of the last decade,
at least. Yeah, of the last decade.
Yeah.
In influencing change, he's been dramatic.
Yeah. So do you think he's given the credit he deserves by most of the newspapers?
Hard to say. I mean,
obviously not by The Guardian, but by the sort of more right-leaning newspapers and by the BBC. I don't hear the BBC still report reform with their nose pinched a little bit. It feels to me like they do anyway. Oh, God, we've got to talk about them. I don't like it.
And that's important. It's important that you say that. It feels to you that they do that. And that's, different people think differently about that. I mean, Farage, still yet, is probably not given the credit he deserves and that sort of thing, but he's beginning to be treated, I think, with more respect, if that's the right word, in the sense that I think people are now seeing that this is a very powerful populist movement, and he's essentially the Pied Piper at the top of that, isn't he? So he deserves to be taken seriously now, and if you can be bothered to spend your life on social media looking at politics and things like that, it's quite a force. Reform dominates conversations on social media now.
You're right. It's interesting. I haven't really studied this too closely, and I should have done because of what we're talking about here. But the BBC has always, attempted neutrality. Of course, they have, and left and right, both sides, haven't they? They've got to listen to both and hopefully report somewhere in the middle, right? But with reform, where does that stand? Is that something on the right, or is that something above that or below it? How are they going to approach that? Or is it almost like a bunch of pundits over here chucking like cement over the other side and hoping it might get some structure?
If you listen to a broadcast report, you'll see, it'll almost reflect the relevant parties. in that, they'll say, the Prime Minister has announced this, the official opposition said it was hopeless. But now you'll start to see, I think, what reforms say will be reported in that chain as well now, and have to be in the run-up to elections.
One thing they are doing is they're motivating people who weren't really political to vote. It says, I did a chat GPT, who is the average Reform voter, and it's Dave from Doncaster, who is a 62-year-old retired lorry driver. Exactly the sort of people who never used to vote because they're all saying, what's the point in me voting? And those people now feel like there's a point in voting, there's a point in engaging with the political process. That's not a bad thing. It's good if we can get more people engaged in the political process, because it has felt to me for a long time that basically it doesn't matter who you vote in, we're all hamstrung by the debt, and as a result everyone's got to do pretty much the same thing. Look at what Labour are managing to achieve. Every time they put in place something which is going to designed to bring down the debt, their backbenchers and the left-wing press are up in arms and say, well, you're taking money away from people who can't afford to take money away.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because
U-turn follows U-turn.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because it'll be very interesting in the next election, because I don't think reform will be strong enough by then.
No.
But what they will do is they'll completely split any Conservative vote, if there was one.
Yeah.
So it's almost...
Labour likely to get in again.
Of course. And it could be that way, to be honest, for quite a while.
Well, and the polling I saw over the weekend, the latest poll I've seen, said that Reform would win 340 seats.
Yeah, they'd get a majority. But that's 4 years from an election.
It is 4 years from an
That's
election.
people saying who they'd vote for with no actual need to vote.
But do you think that's the sort of... our attitude towards that is very similar to the American attitude, when Kamala Harris came...
Yes, it could be.
...right into the rescue of the states, and everyone was going, oh, Taylor Swift thinks she's great, blah, 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 blah. And then, she gets absolutely hammered in the election because Trump was saying the things that real people think.
Yeah.
Could be. And if it is, it is. I want a politician who'll tell the truth. And the truth is we are massively in debt and need to save money a lot. We need to stop paying so much for our debt and thereby free up money to spend on other things. And we have to pay down that debt. But no politician will do it. No politician will sit there and say, we've got some really bad choices to make. We're going to need to cut the NHS funding. We're going to need to cut welfare spending. We have to do that because we've got to spend more on defence because of what's going on over there in Russia. And no one will say it. No one will say it and back it up and actually do it. Wes Streeting said we're going to have to reform the NHS, and every time they try and have the conversation, The Guardian and co are up in arms and stop them from having even a conversation about it.
You love The Guardian, don't you?
I hate it.
Wes Streeting's actually got
paper.
a strong chance of being a future leader, I think. And
Yeah.
he's a younger chap than Farage, isn't he? It might be quite an interesting battleground in the future, perhaps.
To me, it's our fault. It's the population's fault. We won't listen to reason. We just want more and more now and now. And at some point, we're going to have so much debt that it's all going to implode. And that way, no one will get what they want at that point.
But Rob, every country's got masses of debt. I mean, it's just a cyclical. It just moves around. That's all it is.
So who's got all the money?
Saudi Arabia.
It's an interesting question.
And
Who's got
Iran.
all the money? And Putin, reputedly the world's richest person.
It's a really interesting one, though, when it comes to debt, isn't it? These
Who owns that debt?
trillions of debt. Who's got it?
China apparently own quite a lot of our debts, don't they?
We're into conspiracy theory land, though, aren't we?
Well, yeah.
I like the one that there's no gold in Fort Knox, all gone. Someone took it, Rob.
I've got a friend who's got out of crypto and started buying gold. It's the only safe place to have your money nowadays, mate. It's the only place. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Could be right. It doesn't feel very safe. Anyway, we seem to have gone into conspiracy theories. Have we got much more to talk about with reform? Do we think, what's the future for reform? Do we think they can become a party that is accepted by all sides as being electable and serious? It still feels like they're not necessarily seen as serious, that they're seen as a protest party as it stands. When do they are they going to be able to sustain this momentum when they stop being a protest party?
It depends on many things, doesn't it? You know, what are the Tories going to do? Are the Tories going to come back to life in any sort of form? Are the Tories going to look to pair up with Reform? You know, are they going to some sort of coalition between the two? If I was Reform at the minute, I'd say no, not a chance. I actually think we've seen a massive shift in UK and global politics. Actually, it was certainly in Western Europe and the United States, and I think the old traditional two-party system has gone out the window. There's a new player, but it's a classic disruptor, isn't it? Because, you know, like Trump, Farage at the minute he can effectively say anything.
Yeah. And that's my point, really. At the moment, he can say whatever he likes and everyone goes, oh, yeah, that Nigel Farage talks a lot of sense. Whereas at some point, they've got to deliver. They've just won a lot of councils, so they've got to start to be seen to be competent as well as just say stuff.
Still don't think that people will judge him on the performance of Lincolnshire County Council.
No, agreed.
You know, if indeed that's one of the ones they hold. I think it's about, at the minute, all they've got to do is keep, you know, whistling for the dog, if you know what I mean, and keep in the headlines and almost keep out of trouble, because, you know, it's almost like Boris, isn't it, at the minute? You know, Farage. I've seen a couple of headlines when he's referred to as Nigel now. You know, so, you know, I saw a live blog this morning when, you know, Nigel says this, Nigel says that. You know, he's becoming even more of this sort of populist figure who's prepared to sort of call things that. So, yeah, I think if you're not a fan, then get used to it, because I think they're around. Reform are around.
Interesting times ahead.
It'd be the election. I mean, clearly the polls are telling us what's happening at the moment, but there's a difference, I think, between polls 4 years in advance of an election and on the ground voting when it really matters. 4 years is a long time, and the cliche goes, you know, a day is a long time, a week is a long time in politics, isn't it? Right. So we will see, but I don't know. You know, Trump did it, but he's 7 levels and grades ahead of Farage in terms of that kind of leader.
Plus,
perhaps not a politician, but a leader. And I wonder as well if the British public are inherently more conservative than the Americans. When it really matters, will they just bottle it,
probably,
right, and go, oh no, we'll vote Labour?
Yeah, probably.
Don't know.
We'll see.
We will see. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this show. Thank you for listening. This has been Stop the Press, and we were talking about reform and political journalism. Goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye from us.